While there is a world trend on the inclusion of persons with disability in this complex society, the rights of a disabled person in developing countries, particularly in India, are almost non existent, where the rights of a girl or a woman are also vulnerable. Women and girls with disability thus face twice the discrimination. Shanta Memorial Rehabilitation Center, a credible disabled persons organization (DPO) based in Orissa, India, along with Development Research Institute presents e-courses to increase knowledge on gender issues focusing on gender-based violence against women with disabilities, living independently and inclusion in the society from a human rights perspective. This web based course is titled Insidious Violence and Women with Disabilities. This academic endeavor was designed keeping in mind the COVID 19 restrictions and the shift of focus from classroom lectures to a virtual learning environment.
Thank you everyone for joining us today. You at least on the program because for Anastasia it's late night, 10:30, 10:30, no, 9:30 at night. Um, I've known Anastasia for a very long time. We work very, very closely, and it's good to have her here because I know that uh, the amount of knowledge that she has on women with disabilities. We have been working together at the Conference of State Parties and also at the CSW and also as part of the Women Enabled International. We have both been working together. So she's a senior legal advisor there at Women Enabled International, and she has been working very closely with UNFPA, and they have brought out a publication which she has done on women and young people with disabilities, guideline for providing right-based and gender-based services to address GBV and SRHR. This is a global publication, and it is available in all the accessible formats, as well as it is also available in a number of other languages. Anastasia and I have spoken together at many meetings together, and I know that she is a very extraordinary good speaker and she regularly speaks at many meetings internationally, and as Women Enabled also does human rights issues. That is the core of providing the organization across the globe help on women and disabilities. In fact, one of the things that we did with Women Enable, at least I did, was to do the UPR. And that was a great support that was given by Women Enable to get the information, the legal information that we needed. She has served as a staff attorney in the protection and advocacy for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities program at Disability Rights New York.
The speaker of this web course is Senior Legal Advisor Anastasia Holobof from Women Enabled International, USA, speaking on Disabled Women and Institutionalization International Perspective.
And thank you all to the students for having me here and for getting up early. I know it's early for you, so I appreciate you accommodating my time zone. I'm here in New York in the US. And I'm really excited to be here with you today. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen because I have a PowerPoint. Let's see. There we go.
And Amrit has joined us as he will be doing the interpretation for ISL.
Oh, wonderful. Yeah. Thank you so much to the interpreter. I know this is a hard job. I will speak as slowly as possible.
That's the way I mentioned it.
Clear. Okay, great. So I was asked today to speak about women with disabilities in institutionalized settings and the data collection challenges that come from that. I have some experience from when I was at Disability Rights New York, specifically on institutionalization. In New York, we have still large-scale institutions which are being phased out as a result of a Supreme Court case, but that was over 10 years ago, and we still have them across the state. And what we really have is group homes, which I'll talk a bit about more later, but essentially they were a model that has been pushed internationally for how you kind of move from institutionalized settings of kind of thousands and hundreds of people into kind of community-based living. But what we really had seen in New York is often they become very small institutions with all of the same problems of the large institutions. So that really gave me some experience that I'll be talking about today of really the harmful practices that can really be in place when you put people in institutionalized settings, and what we can really do about that, particularly when it comes to women and violence that they experience in those settings. So I work for a global nonprofit, as Asha mentioned, called Women Enabled International. We're a small nonprofit based in the US, but working globally. Our mission is to advance human rights at the intersection of gender and disability, to respond to the lived experiences of women and girls with disabilities, to promote inclusion and participation, and to achieve transformative equality. We are one of the few global nonprofits that really works at this intersection of women with disabilities, and we really came about because our founder, Stephanie Ortaleva, really saw a gap between the human rights world that was focused on gender and advancing gender and women's rights issues, and the disability space, and the two would never speak to each other. So what we really do is make sure that women, girls, people who identify as non-binary or gender non-conforming, but who face issues at the intersection of gender, are really brought into the conversation, and their issues remain at the forefront. Our vision that we're working towards is that we envision a world where women, girls with disabilities can claim their human rights, act in solidarity, and live self-determined lives. Okay, so women with disabilities living in institutional settings. So I wanted to get us started by just kind of having us understand what we mean when we say institutions. Institutions can come in a variety of forms. Obviously, it's very country dependent, and it really, there are certain characteristics I'll talk about in a moment that you can use to kind of identify what it means to be in an institutional setting. But when we talk about institutions, we're generally talking about psychiatric institutions for people with psychosocial disabilities, residential institutions, so particularly for people with developmental disabilities like intellectual disabilities, autism, basically places where people go at any age to live and get full-time care that isn't from their family. Orphanages, camps, psychiatric camps, for example, nursing homes, group homes, which I mentioned, which are generally kind of small scale, anywhere from kind of 4 to kind of 10 is the general ideal for a group home, but you might see them if it's a medicalized group home up to kind of 50 people. That's how I've seen them here in the US at least, but the idea being that they're not kind of the 100+ institutional settings. And then we also want to expand our definition to think about institutions can also include jails and prisons, and that's kind of a space that often gets forgotten. And then you also want to think about institutional settings as day programs, so places people might still live at home, but they spend all their day in a day program as an adult, kind of no longer in a school setting, but in a program setting for the bulk of the day. So the characteristics of any institutional setting that you can kind of use in the country context you're working in. Obviously, I'm not an expert on the Indian context, so I don't want to speak that I know exactly what your institutional settings are going to look like. So I want to make sure you kind of understand globally what the characteristics are, and you can apply them to the settings you're coming in contact with. So generally they have one or more of the following characteristics. The first is that they're staffed by caregivers who are not related to the person. That's kind of a key factor that cuts across all those settings I was just describing, because the key factor is that for whatever reason, the family or the individual is not able to support themselves, or the family isn't able to support them. So they have moved into this setting where there are external people providing that support. The next is that they don't give the person with the disability the power to hire or to fire those caregiving staff. So a characteristic is that legal capacity, that freedom of choice to be able to decide who your support person is going to be for whatever level of support you require as a person with a disability, that you don't have the power to say, this person isn't right for me for whatever reason, or this person is abusive, I don't want them to work with me anymore. Relatedly, institutional settings generally restrict a person with a disability's ability to make a choice and their independence with where they can go, who they can visit, what they can eat, what general choices they can make for their lives. Next is that oftentimes an institutional setting will be certified by the state or a state agency. That's kind of characteristic of the fact that they're getting money from the state to provide these services to persons with disabilities. But that certainly doesn't mean that means they're quality services. Generally to that end, they're subject to state rules and regulations, so policies, regulations, funding restrictions, etc. And last is that there's often monitoring requirements that come with those regulations and rules. So it can be a combination of those things that make a setting an institutional setting. So what is so concerning about institutional settings is that historically, people with disabilities have always been placed in institutional settings for a variety of reasons, but at its core, the reasons kind of fundamentally speak to the discrimination that people with disabilities experience, and the fact that a lot of the times it comes down to that people would prefer to not see people with disabilities in their community and not invest in the supports necessary to enable someone to live in their community, whether that be if their family needs those supports or if they, as an adult, need those supports to be able to live in their community. And so traditionally, we've seen in every country across the globe, different forms of institutional settings where people with disabilities across the spectrum of disabilities are moved from their homes, either as a child or as an adult, into a setting where they are isolated and the community doesn't have to reconcile with the ableism or the discrimination that is inherent in our society towards people with disabilities, to be able to address what it is exactly that is required to be able to enable people with disabilities to be treated equally in the society. So this isolation is really kind of a key element of any institutional setting. And with that comes a host of risks in any setting where someone is isolated from their community, from any of their supports, from people who trust and understand them. So related to that, in an institutional setting, you have denial of the right to live independently and in one's community, which is one of the key rights enshrined in the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And that really comes out of the fact of the deinstitutionalized movement, which is the movement globally to have people with disabilities have the right to live in their communities. Because for so long, and in many countries still, that's not a given. That the right to live in your community for a person with a disability is still very much up for debate in many countries. And that's because of many reasons based on discrimination. Common ones include kind of the danger that people with disabilities pose, the cost that the argument that it's cheaper to provide support for people with disabilities in institutional settings, which has largely been debunked globally, that that's not the case. It's cheaper to have people live in their community settings. And then, like I said, the fact that it's easier to not deal with the discrimination when people are isolated and living in an institutional setting. In an institutional setting, there is inherently an increased risk of violence. The violence is primarily in institutional settings found to be perpetrated by caregivers and staff members. It's primarily a result of the nature of the isolation and the vulnerability because of the lack of access to the outside world, the lack of access to independent sources to make a complaint, and the vulnerability and power dynamics that are at play in an institution where people with disabilities have even less power because their rights have generally been stripped when they have entered the institutional setting. And unfortunately, this leads to violence of all forms by caregivers and staff, ranging from physical abuse, oftentimes under the guise of, uh, uh, treatment in the form of electroshocks therapy, or just in terms of discipline, to sexual abuse from caregivers and staff. There's documented cases globally of human trafficking as a form of increased risk of violence, particularly because in so many institutional settings, people have been severed from their family and their community. There's really they're vulnerable for people, traffickers being able to easily remove them from those settings. So there's Disability Rights International's reports from Mexico that really shows that connection where people were trafficked out of institutional settings by pimps purporting to be interested in marrying some of the young women, or the fact that caregivers would take advantage of the institutionalized setting and utilize it as a way to pimp out the women with disabilities. So that's from DRI's reports on Mexico. Similarly, the European Parliament, when they did a survey of women with disabilities who were in institutional settings, they found that 80% of women with disabilities had been victims of violence, and that women with disabilities were up to 4 times more at risk of sexual violence than their peers without disabilities, in part because of that institutionalization they experience. Next is the deprivation of legal capacity. So just in case you haven't covered this yet, by that I mean the fact that people with disabilities have the right, as anyone does, to be able to make their own legal decisions about what they do with their lives in all forms, but that right is often denied, particularly for people with psychosocial disabilities and with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And since those are 2 communities that are widely institutionalized, but broadly, anyone who ends up in an institutional setting, generally that goes hand in hand with the denial of legal capacity, because frankly, I don't think anyone would ever choose to live in an institutional setting. And so if you're going to be in an institutional setting, at some point someone has denied your ability to make those decisions, and that's how you end up in there. But that also means there's no way to get out. So you are then stuck in this setting that no matter how abusive or harmful it is for you, there is no legal way for you to be able to extricate yourself from that setting. And in addition to that extremely harmful consequence, there's also just the denial of the basic rights of any individual to choose what you eat, to be able to choose what to wear, to be able to choose when to go to the bathroom, to be able to choose when to go to bed. Just the denial of those basic decision-making capabilities that all of us are both entitled to and a part of what enables us to live lives. So oftentimes, people with disabilities are caught in institutional settings that deny them more rights than a person without a disability who is incarcerated and has had those rights taken away as a result of being criminally charged. But oftentimes people with disabilities have even more rights removed from them and no way to, finish their sentence or whatever might be optional for a prisoner. And then related to that, at its worst, we can really see this denial of legal capacity in the form of procedures and medications that a person can take. And that's something, again, that's been documented that particularly harmful for people with women with disabilities. So I'm talking about forced sterilization or forced contraception. And what has been found in a number of countries, again, it was found in the DRI report in Mexico, was that particularly because of how common it is for sexual violence to happen in an institutional setting, DRI found in the Mexican institution they were studying that the institutional providers were, without asking the consent of the women in the institution, were providing everybody with contraception pills as a way to cover up the sexual abuse that was happening. Because as happens very regularly in institutions, I've come across it myself as well, is that oftentimes sexual abuse isn't discovered until a woman with a disability in that setting shows up pregnant and can't give an explanation for how she ended up pregnant. And it's not from being able to be in a free relationship, because that's oftentimes another right that is denied in an institutional setting. And then the other key issues that come up in an institutional setting are really the lack of legal protection. As I said, the rights of a person in institutional setting are often even less than a person who is in a prison setting. And that's because of this, the fact that someone with a disability is denied inherently the legal capacity to be able to enter as soon as they enter the institutional setting. So there's really a lack oftentimes of safeguards to enable someone to be able to seek legal recourse for anything they're experiencing. And then lastly, just the community prejudice. So even if a person is able to kind of engage in the community or leave the institution from the institutional setting, they often face a huge amount of discrimination just based on the fact that they were in an institutional setting in the first place, and their association with that institution. And that really speaks to kind of a broader disability discrimination that is experienced, but also the isolation that they experienced that prevents them being seen as valuable members of the community. So some key considerations relating to institutional settings. That is particularly something that if you go into work that involves entering or working with women in institutional settings, are really important to keep in mind because they can really impede the ability to connect with, document, and help provide recourse if you are an attorney to a person in an institutional setting. So one thing, and I've certainly seen this myself, is that a person with disability who is placed in an institutional setting where they experience violence and abuse so oftentimes someone who hasn't had the support to be able to communicate their needs will react aggressively, and that in turn is used to justify keeping them in an institutional setting. So one thing I've seen regularly is someone who, might have, with the right support, be able to live a very full and effective and joyful life in the community is basically kept in the institutional setting based on that their behavior doesn't allow them to live in the community, but really it's the harm that's being caused by the institutional setting that is leading to the behavior that is essentially just a form of communication that is then keeping them in the institutional setting. So it's really worth keeping that in mind and not really questioning whenever a provider or a family member or whoever it may be justifies the institutionalization of someone based on certain behaviors or aggression they're exhibiting, and really asking what that behavior is in fact communicating. Another consideration is that in general, monitoring visits and inspections of institutions, even though they might be happening because the state says that that's what they're doing, that, don't worry, we're doing our very best, this is a great facility. In generally, those monitoring visits are generally ineffective in identifying and responding to violence, just because of the nature of the violence that is being experienced through the power dynamic, and that there's often an inability to be able to gain the trust of an institutionalized person to be able to really find out what is happening. Next is that laws and policies often promote or fail to prevent forced institutionalization. Although on its face, countries like India that have ratified the CRPD, or countries like the US that have laws that say there shouldn't be institutionalization, it generally requires substantial advocacy to actually make that happen, particularly for people with psychosocial disabilities because of the immense discrimination that it's experienced, particularly relating to justifying their institutionalization based on a purported fear of what they might do if they are in the community. And then peer-to-peer violence is also something to consider, that takes place in institutional settings. Oftentimes it can be related to overcrowding or staff that is ill-equipped to support a person's disability. Oftentimes it can be related to personalities, people being stuck in rooms together and forced to spend all their time with someone they don't get along with. And again, lacking the ability to kind of make a choice of who they spend their time with. And so again, that's oftentimes used to keep someone institutionalized for a longer period than would be justified, even if there is a justification. Next would be to make sure you always consider the increased barriers to seeking help. In any institutional setting that I've encountered, you'll always be told by providers that that there are ways that a person can make a complaint, that there are ways that a person can seek help if they need, that there are ways a person can talk about the violence if they experienced it. But the fact of the matter is, in most institutional settings, that is not the case, and that there is actually no way that a person is able to privately, in an accessible way, seek help from someone objective outside of the institutional setting. So given what I said earlier, that most of the violence or abuse that people experience is perpetrated by staff, if there's no one to tell that isn't a staff member, there's no way to seek real recourse if someone is experiencing abuse. And remember that many people, especially those who have been institutionalized from a young age, might not even be able to recognize the abuse they are experiencing or the violence they experience as abuse because they've never known anything different. So in any institutional setting, to even uncover a lot of the abuse that is of the barriers and the poor levels of support that a person with this disability has experienced, their lack of access to communication devices, the lack of access to interpreters. There isn't even an opportunity to speak to that person in private should you have the chance to, without a staff member who could potentially be an abuser or know the abuser as well. And then lastly, you know, not every staff person who works at an institutional setting is a bad person, but those who do have the best of intentions generally lack the time or capacity to be able to provide the education, the support to identify themselves any gender-based violence that might be going on and provide any sort of valuable services to a person to help um, extricate them from that situation. So that's how you see situations like the one I mentioned in Mexico, where you have providers just covering up the abuse rather than trying to address it. We, with help of people like Asha, have been doing surveys globally of how the COVID-19 pandemic has affected women with disabilities. And one thing that we've seen globally is that there has been an increased risk of institutionalization during this period. And that's just because of the massive economic and practical impacts on families and individuals with disabilities. And as people with disabilities have lost their support systems, have lost their funds, families have lost their funds to be able to provide that support to their loved ones with disabilities, many people have been forced into institutional settings or at risk of institutional settings during this crisis. And on the other hand, we've also seen excess number of deaths of people with disabilities in institutional settings because of the poor healthcare, the overcrowding that exists in institutional settings. So one issue we face here in the US is that the excess deaths that have taken place in nursing homes, which include many people with developmental disabilities are also in those nursing homes, as is the case in group homes here in the US. So even as small as 10, just because of the lack of safeguards and the staff that are coming in and out in those settings. So just to highlight some data collection issues, if you're collecting data in these settings, obviously keep in mind those key considerations I mentioned. But the other things I wanted to mention are isolation and access is always going to be a challenge. There's a disincentive for institutional providers to allow access to institutionalized persons. Most institutional settings, are either receiving their funding from the government, and so allowing you to collect data is only going to put them at risk of losing that funding. Similarly, if they're a private provider, you've got similar issues related to risk of losing funds and risk of having issues with the institutional setting, like I just mentioned, being highlighted. Next would be just the challenges with collecting the data and being sure of its accuracy. Most providers are going to put up roadblocks to be able to collect data privately with people with disabilities. Practically, in terms of denial of objective interpreters or people not having communication devices they can use to speak privately, but also just not providing you with a space to be able to speak to that person, and kind of utilizing that power dynamic that prevents a person kind of consenting to be in a private interview with you, and because you are coming in as a stranger and you're working up against all the power dynamics that are in place in that setting already. Next is just trauma, recognizing that all those issues that I laid out earlier, many people you will encounter will have experienced those issues, and that has resulted in a trauma that is going to make it very challenging to gain someone's trust and be able to gain accurate information based on a short conversation with them. Next is, I mentioned this earlier, the lack of access to communication devices and supports. This is an issue, though, I've seen regularly, which is that someone who maybe would have been provided with the supports they best needed to be able to kind of say how they feel or be able to express themselves, be it in a communications kind of board with pictures or a digital format or phone, doesn't have that access in an institutional setting, either on purpose or just because of lack of funds. But for people in institutional settings who have literally never even encountered some of the words or an opportunity to speak about those issues, let alone kind of learned about their own body or their rights related to their body, if you come in asking questions related to that to collect data on, how many institutionalized women have, received comprehensive sex education, you need to remember you might be starting from a place where someone has no idea even what the name of what word to use for their breasts, let alone what a mammogram is. And so taking that step back and making sure that you are also offering that information if you're in a space so that someone can provide you with the accurate information as well. So as I said, I'm certainly not an expert on the Indian context. One of the most uh, effective reports that I've come across is the Human Rights Watch report, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with since it's from 2014, that really kind of addressed institutionalization, particularly of women and girls with psychosocial intellectual disabilities across India. Asha and Nidhi, who I know is speaking to you in a few weeks, I believe were both involved in the report, so they would be able to speak better to it and certainly give you a better update than me. But I just wanted to highlight that as a key summary of some of the issues that existed 6 years ago. And in my experience, these things take a lot longer than 6 years to address. So I would certainly treat this as a key document for understanding the Indian context of institutionalized women with disabilities. Some of the key issues that were found reflect the global issues I've already mentioned. So involuntary admission and arbitrary detention in mental hospitals and residential care institutions. So two of those big kind of institutional settings we already mentioned. And issues that were found in the report were overcrowding and lack of hygiene, inadequate access to general health care, including sexual and reproductive health care for women and girls, forced treatment, including electroconvulsive therapy, as well as all forms of violence, from physical, verbal to sexual violence. One thing that was highlighted in the report was that, as we mentioned, most people with disabilities are not going to ever choose to live in an institutional setting. And so the report found that in the Indian context, families, legal guardians, and child welfare committees were really the source of how women and girls with psychosocial and intellectual disabilities ended up being admitted into those settings without their consent. Some other issues that were highlighted, particularly for women with disabilities, is that they were often institutionalized because families were unable to care for them, leading to their forced institutionalization. There was rife sexual violence identified in all of the settings, and the denial of access to reproductive health for women in these settings. So as Asha mentioned, we at Women Enabled have been working closely with the United Nations Population Fund on how to address and improve gender-based violence and sexual and reproductive health and rights services for women and young people with disabilities. As part of this work, we published this document that Asha mentioned, and it's the purpose of the report was to provide practical guidance to ensure that those services give full effect to the rights of women and young people with disabilities. And the setting is for providers and support staff, but it's also intended for all stakeholders. And I'm going to mention it now because it includes a subchapter on institutionalized persons with disabilities experiencing violence and what it means to provide quality gender-based violence services to people in those settings, which I hope will be illustrative to you of what it means to actually provide quality services and realize some of the rights of women and people in institutionalized settings. So it's chapter, if you do end up looking at the guidelines, it's chapter 3.8. And the first kind of, the guidelines divide quality services into 4 elements, the first being that it's available. So in order to prevent institutionalization or address women who are in those settings, it's essential to empower families and caregivers to care for people with disabilities in community-based settings to avoid institutionalization in the first place. So that means diverting funding away from these big institutional settings and really investing in small community support that enables a family to, if it's a person who still lives at home, to get that additional support so that they don't reach a point where they feel they have to forcibly institutionalize their family member, or if someone is living or wants to live independently, that they have access to those supports in their community. The next is to create programs that support people with disabilities, to build relationships, friendships, and community-based support networks. So really making sure that we are investing in people to be able to be valuable members of their own community, to have, community networks, so that there's not that risk that they will be isolated and placed in an institutional setting. Because they're recognized as a key member of the community and not someone to be shunned away and hidden away. The next is to develop programs to assist persons with disabilities who are already in institutional setting to be able to move out. Oftentimes this comes in the form of case coordinators or community-based supports, supported decision-making to be able to actually regain those legal decisions for themselves. So this is an issue that generally is overlooked, is that if we're going to stop the institutionalization of women with disabilities, we have to have programs that are actively enabling people to get out of those settings. Next is to develop training programs for institutional settings for women with disabilities and young people with disabilities to learn about their rights and gender-based violence. So making sure that people with disabilities are empowered and have that information, even if they are in an institutional setting, to be able to speak up where there is a safe setting to do so. Next is just practically making sure that gender-based violence services are available to people in institutional settings so we can actually address them where there are the resources to do so. So that means having private accessible hotlines and creative ways that a person with a disability is able to inform a provider or the police or whoever, the family member, that they are experiencing violence in those settings. To provide gender-based violence services in those settings rather than expecting someone to come to a gender-based violence provider, because we know that there's no way that an institutionalized person is going to be able to reach a provider outside of the institutional setting. The provider must come to them. Next category is acceptability. So we want to make sure that if you're trying to address gender-based violence in these settings, that there needs to be regular in-person visits to the institution by the gender-based violence service providers, and that service provider is either trained in sign language or other forms of communication, and has materials in Braille or other formats, simplified formats for people with intellectual disabilities, and that those are being brought as well. That gender-based violence providers who are seeking to do this work are actually considering the unique forms that can be experienced in those settings, like forced sterilization or contraception, and addressing them accordingly. Next, that people with disabilities and their family members are meaningfully engaged in placement decisions, and that the priority is community-based and independent options. For families, particularly for young children families can often feel that they have no other option but an institutionalized setting. So it's imperative if we're going to avoid people being institutionalized, that families are given that support and that education to understand what community-based living is, how it will actually work practically for their loved ones, and actually provide that support to both the family and the person with the disability to be able to make the choices for what is best for them. And next is to advocate for an independent, confidential, and accessible complaint system. Some countries have put in ombudsmans for the institutional settings that are in place, and those ombudsmans have developed those kind of complaint systems. It's not going to be a long-term solution, but it is an essential step in uncovering the abuses that happen in institutional settings. And lastly is the quality of services. So collecting data on women with disabilities and young persons with disabilities receiving care. I've addressed the challenges, but that doesn't mean it's still an essential component. And also making sure that providers are required to provide that data, including data on abuse, injury, etc. To develop and administer programs for institutional settings designed to improve quality of care and reduce the risk. Because people with disabilities are not prioritized, the regulations and the policies and expectations on the providers who provide those services are oftentimes pretty low. So as long as they are going to exist, making sure that those quality, the expectation of the life supports that are in place are high. For example, ensuring that providers do provide people with the right to make decisions about their life, to make decisions about when to have a way that that person can request to no longer be institutionalized and have the reasons they're institutionalized reviewed. Next is to build the capacity of independent monitoring bodies, especially relating to gender-based violence, who are trying to do that work to monitor the settings. However much we know that might not be 100% effective, it sure is better than nothing. Next is advocate for behavioral health courts and other specialized courts and trainings. So these are a model that has been used in North America to some extent, of basically diverting people with psychosocial disabilities away from institutionalized settings where they will, be charged with the crime, and before they are convicted of it, they will be institutionalized for the rest of their life, regardless of whether they committed the crime. But a behavioral health court is a court that is specialized in recognizing how a person's mental illness might have affected the decision making and coming up with alternate care solutions that aren't incarceration or institutionalization. Next is to engage family members of people with institutions. For the reasons I just articulated, that a person's family can often not want a person in that setting, but feel that that's the only option. The only important thing to remember is that oftentimes family are themselves abusive or have placed that person in that setting for abusive reasons. So it's essential that the person with the disability makes the decision to want their family to be involved if the family is going to be engaged. And last is to assess the laws and policies that contribute to institutionalization and develop strategies to advocate for legal and policy change. So figuring out what it is, what are the gaps in the law, or what is it about the law that leads to a person being institutionalized, and really targeting those issues. Okay, so that is the end of my presentation. I hope that that was helpful. I saw a few things coming up in the chat, but I'm happy to stay on for a little longer to answer any questions if that would be helpful.
I think there will be some questions in the chat.
Okay, so I see this question about people who are institutionalized as a way to kind of protect them from their own relatives. Yes, I've certainly seen that in the US as well as globally. I think both to prevent them from being sexually abused by family members, but also all forms of violence from family members. it's a very common situation because of the failure of alternate models of where a child, especially someone under 18, but any person with a disability, an alternative for a community-based setting that isn't requiring a family member to be involved. And I think it's really an important component to keep in mind, particularly if you're involved at all in the policy development relating to people with disabilities, is recognizing that family members are often abusive, and that a person needs an opportunity to be able to have a community-based option. So a supportive apartment where they have the power to be able to make their own decisions that isn't an institutional setting, and recognizing that while it might seem like a good option to have them move out of the abusive home into an institutional setting, every evidence any person I've ever spoken to in an institutional setting, you are moving someone from one abusive setting to another abusive setting. So trying to find another alternative is really key to addressing abuse, not kind of shifting it to a different location. Let me see. So the question about how the Indian parents don't want to take care of girls with disabilities and send them to an institution. Yeah, that's something we see globally. It's not unique to India, but I can understand the context. I think it's unique to the context of women with disabilities, and not a question of responsibility shifting. It's really a question of what do those women with disabilities want, and that they are the ones who are responsible for themselves. They are the ones who should be able to be empowered to make the decisions for themselves. And so provide, really prioritizing policy and programs that enable a woman with a disability to be able to provide for herself, or have access to supports that enable her to be able to live independently, whatever that looks like for her. But I think your point is very important because of the fact that that's unique to the experience, particularly of women with disabilities, and needs to be focused on, that isn't as common for men with disabilities. I think those are the only two questions I saw, and I can share the PowerPoint as with Asha, so she can share it if that would help.
Yeah, we will share the PowerPoint with the students. Before Umul comes in, and we thank you for this presentation. There are certain things that I would like to also talk a little bit about the Indian setting and how it emerged. One of the things was that this was a very powerful intervention and during the negotiations of the CRPD. And though they tried to get the word psychosocial disability on board, it could not come. But on the other hand, the World Network of users and survivors of psychiatry, Tina Minkowitz and all these people have been trying for a long time to see that where psychosocial disability is concerned becomes a core part of the UNCRPD implementation. And for that, there has been a move across the globe that institutions should be completely abolished. Now, in India, that is also one of the stand that has been taken, like, for example, Bhargavi Davar, who has written a number of books and is well known for her work on psychosocial disability, that we deinstitutionalize and have people looking after only in the community. On the other hand, there are organizations like Anjali Ratnabali Rai in Calcutta, and there are many other organizations who feel that the state, even if you deinstitutionalize, the community is yet not prepared to take them. So it is better to look at institutions and see that they become better and follow the laws that are there. So there is there's a big debate across it globally, But on the whole, people are now shifting to the fact that institutions should be abolished. One of the reasons in India, for example, you talked about the Human Rights Watch, um, which was done by Shanta Rao Variga, and we were involved. It was done in Pune, and Bhargavi was involved in that. The immense amount of violence that was perpetuated against women that was shown. Uh, we will share the link with you today. You can look at the report. There are two reports, in fact, another one which followed up with on justice. Mm, and there's another case that took place in India, which many might be aware, some might not, and that is the one of a school called Asha Kiran in Delhi, where children who had intellectual disability had been abandoned or stayed there for so long. And then it was found out by the women's movement or in disability and people like Radhika Al-Ghazi that things were not right. This was a government institution. And when they went into it and the court gave an order and the National Human Rights Committee that it should be looked into, it was a disastrous situation where children had been abandoned, no one was taking care of them, whether they were educated or not, though it was an educational institution. So the court rulings have already come on that, and they are taking further steps. But these kind of things that happen, and the debate on the electrical convulsive therapy, which you talk about ECT, that also in the Mental Health Act, there was a large debate on it that it should be left out. But the psychiatrists feel that in some situations it is very important. But the disability movement on the whole has said that it should not be allowed to go on. So in India, there is a very strong movement that there should be no institutions at all, and that ECT should be banned. But on the other hand, there are also some organizations which feel that they need support. In fact, one of the organizations that was dealing with the parents of intellectual disability has now kind of dissolved because the psychosocial disability group wanted that parents should not be involved, and in this case, as you mentioned also. So, but some people, even in the disability movement, still feel that children with intellectual disability do need support, but then support does not have to be that they talk for them or they work for them. The support is that they themselves can talk, they themselves can work out what they want to do. So this is something I think in institutionalization we have to come forward and debate on it. But on the whole, it's good for us to get the perception of uh, the international angle, as you put it, and we know what is happening there. And we will today share all the resources that we have collected and all the your video also with the students, and also books and journals which are free and available to them. And that also will be shared. So thank you so much, Anastasia. I know it's late. It's time for you to go to sleep. And we look forward to hearing from you again.
Great.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you, everyone. Thank you for letting me join your class, and thank you for inviting me, Asha. Good night, everyone.